Hi, I'm going to be reading Chapter 6 of the Geography of You and Me. Owen was standing in the middle of Broadway when the lights came back. The plastic bag he was carrying just split open as he crossed the street, and the 3 lukewarm water bottles he'd finally found at a hot dog cart near the park had gone rolling towards the curb. As he scrambled to collect them, he glanced sideways down the darkened alley of the avenue, and it was just as he straightened up again that it happened. It was as if someone had flipped a switch. Just like that, the city was plugged in again. Owen stood there blinking as the street lamps came to life, the windows and signs all along Broadway switching on just after them, once again bathing the street in an artificial glow. There was almost a reverential pause as everyone stared, slack-jawed, and then the heat-weary crowd stirred into action again, and a great cheer went up. People whooped and clapped as if discovering rain after a long drought, and even the police officers who stood stern-faced at the corner couldn't help grinning, their eyes sweeping over the restored reds and greens of the traffic lights. A few people ran past Owen, eager to get home, and a man with a dog tucked under his arm did a little jig on the corner. Everyone wore the same expression, halfway between relief and amazement, and all of them were squinting. In just over 24 hours, they'd become unaccustomed to the brightness of their own city, and faced with it now, in all its intensity, they cupped their hands over their eyes as if staring into the sun. Owen tucked the water bottles into the crook of his arm, letting the crowd surge around him, and he thought about what Lucy had said the night before, about how you can be surrounded by so many people here, but still entirely on your own. He saw the truth in it now, but it felt lonelier than what he'd imagined. And he lifted his gaze to the building on the corner of Broadway and 72nd, wishing he was someone different, the kind of guy who would run up 24 flights of stairs just to see her again, even for a minute. He hadn't meant to abandon her this morning, but when he had woken up with the sun on his face and Lucy curled beside him, her eyelids fluttering in sleep, he was gripped by the sudden worry about his dad, who might well have returned by then to an empty apartment, with no idea where his son could have disappeared to on such a muddled and hectic night. His plan was to run downstairs, check the apartment, leave a note if Dad wasn't there yet, and then climbed the 42 stories back up to the roof before Lucy woke up. Even as he clambered down the long flight of steps, he was already thinking of that space on the blanket where he'd lie down again and wait for her eyes to open so they could start the day together. But when he made it down to the basement, it was to find his dad slumped in the front hallway of the apartment, clammy and shivering in spite of the heat. There was a fine sheen of sweat across his forehead, and his eyes were bright and feverish. Owen's heart was already thumping hard as he slid to the floor. "Dad?" he asked, his voice full of panic and shaking him a little. "Are you okay?" His father had nodded and attempted a feeble smile. "Just a little tired," he said, his tongue too thick in his mouth. "I walked." "You walked? All that way?" He swallowed as though steeling himself to speak, then changed his mind and simply nodded instead. "It's okay," Owen said, repeating the words dumbly as he tried to figure out what to do. "It's okay. I'm here." Dad muttered something else, but his words were slurred and his face had a grayish tinge to it. He must have walked all night, all the way from the very end of Brooklyn. He was clearly dehydrated, and he probably had heat exhaustion too, if not worse. Owen's thoughts were slow and hazy. There was no water pressure, no way to cool him off. He felt frantic as he looked around the apartment without knowing what exactly he was looking for. Something to help, something to make this better. "Look, Dad," Owen said, stooping so that they were at eye level. "I'm going to get you to bed, then go out for some water, okay?" "Okay," he whispered through cracked lips. "I'll be right back," Owen assured him. "You're okay now." He sat back on his heels, shaking his head. "I can't believe you walked all that way to get back home." Owen tilted his head towards the ceiling, trying to swallow the lump in his throat, but all he could think was, "This isn't home." "Okay," he said after a moment, snaking a hand under Dad's arm and around his back. on the count of 3. Once he managed to get his father up and into his bedroom, bearing most of his weight as they shuffled along, he helped lower him down on the top of the sheets, and then promised he'd be back, grabbing the keys and heading for the lobby. He thought of asking one of the doormen for help, but after his dad disappeared yesterday in the middle of one of the biggest crises the city had seen in years, he decided it would be better not to draw any more attention to themselves. He slipped through the lobby, then went sprinting around the corner to the same bodega from last night, but they were out of water, and so were the next 2 shops he tried. His heart was hammering in his chest as he thought of his father. He didn't know much about heat exhaustion other than the importance of water, and as he moved from store to store with no luck, he could feel a widening panic inside him. Finally, he found a pretzel cart with only 2 bottles left, and he practically threw a $5 bill at the man before taking off down the street at a jog. All day he watched over his father. He sat in a chair beside the bed, keeping a damp washcloth pressed to his forehead and fanning the stuffy air with an old tissue of Sports Illustrated. Dad only woke once, and when he did, Owen helped him take a few sips of water. But he fell asleep again almost immediately, and there was nothing to do but sit there looking on helplessly. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that the color slowly began to return to his cheeks, and Owen finally allowed himself to sit back with a sigh, realizing for the first time how tense he'd been all day. When the dusk crept in through the window, dipping the room in shades of blue, Owen had decided it was safe to venture outside again for more water, and he circled the neighborhood for what felt like forever before stumbling across a hot dog vendor who was charging $10 apiece. Now he stood across the street from their building, juggling the bottles in his arms, and watching the giant clock above a department store, which had just come back to life along with everything else. The slow ticking completely at odds with the urgency he felt as he waited for the signal to cross. The lobby was still unbearably hot, but there were a few people standing around the front desk, and Owen bent his head and hurried down the mailroom, hoping to go unnoticed, eager to return to his father. But just before he could disappear through the door, he was pulled up short by the sound of his name. Owen Buckley. His first thought, strangely, was of Lucy, that something might have happened to her today, that he shouldn't have left her on the roof, that he should have come back for her like he'd meant to, and his chest flooded with fear. But when he swiveled to look, he realized it wasn't that at all, and his shoulders slumped. Striding towards him was Sam Coleman, his father's second cousin and the owner of the building, the one who had given him the job there. The only time Owen had ever seen him was at his mother's funeral, where after the ceremony, in the midst of all the handshakes and kisses, the hugs and condolences, he noticed a man handing his father a business card. Dad had taken it with numb fingers, nodding mechanically, and Owen watched as he slipped it into the pocket of his suit. It wasn't until a few weeks later that he brought it up. "I don't know if you met my cousin Sam at the," he trailed off, unable to say the word funeral. In the days leading up to it, and in the days that had followed, he'd somehow managed to avoid it altogether, talking around it, toward a black hole that had opened up in the very center of their lives. Owen shook his head. They were sitting at the kitchen table, an untouched casserole dish between them, one of the dozens that were stacked like bricks in the fridge. "He offered me a job in New York," Dad said, raising his eyes from the table, where a column of light from the window spotlighted a thin layer of dust. Already, the house no longer felt like the same one they'd lived in just 10 days before. "New York City?" Dad nodded. "He owns a few buildings there," he explained. He wants me to manage one of them." "Why?" Owen asked, and Dad was silent for a moment. The question wasn't a necessary one. He'd been out of work for almost a year now, a contractor in a town where there was nothing new to be built. He'd pick up work as a handyman here and there, enough to keep them going, but it wasn't permanent. He needed a job long before the accident, but he still needed one now. "Because," Dad said quietly, Because I'm not sure we can stay here. It wasn't the answer Owen had been looking for. It wasn't even a response to the right question. He didn't know whether his father meant for financial reasons or emotional ones, whether he'd been given this a lot of thought or was just saying it out loud for the first time now. And he wasn't sure how he felt about it yet himself. But even so, he understood. "Let's go out west then," he said, sitting forward at the table. "Let's just get in the car and drive, like you and Mom used to." Dad's eyes flashed with pain at the memory, and he shook his head. "This isn't just some lark, Oh," he said. "We have to be logical about this. There's no work for me here. If we sell the house," he paused, his voice cracking at this, then pushed on, "we'll have the money for whatever's next. But who knows how fast that'll happen. And for now, he's offering us an apartment with the job, and I just can't." "Stay here," Owen had finished. He breathed out, then raised his eyes to meet his dad's. "I know," he said, finally. "Me neither." It was true. Too much had changed. His mother was gone, and the house didn't feel like theirs anymore. Even his two best friends were different. At the funeral, Owen had watched the pair of them, who had said all the right things and been nothing but supportive, begin to laugh helplessly when one tripped over nothing at all, his arms windmilling before he managed to right himself again. They were trying their best to hold it together, their laughter threatening to bubble over, and from across the lawn, Owen just stood there, alone and apart, solemn and heartbroken, and hopelessly, endlessly, miserably sad. And it was then that he felt the first pinpricks of doubt that things would ever be normal again. It had always been the three of them, Owen, Casey, and Josh, a steadfast team, a solid unit. They'd grown up playing hide and seek, and then tag, soccer, then football. They'd studied together 1,000 times and found 1,000 ways to avoid studying at all. They'd talk about girls and sports and their futures. They teased each other mercilessly and had been there for one another in the most surprising of ways. But in that moment, everything was different. They were over there and he was over here, the space between them already too big to cross. And as it turned out, Owen and his dad left town before he even had a chance to try. His best friends becoming just 2 more items on the list of things they left behind. Now his knees felt unsteady as he watched Sam approach him from the other side of the lobby. He was short and dark and broad-shouldered, the opposite of Owen and his dad in every way. He offered a hand when he was close enough, which Owen shook warily. "Nice to see you again," he said, though they hadn't actually met before. "Quite a night, huh?" He didn't wait for a response. "I've been doing the rounds today, checking on all my buildings. Obviously, this thing has caused a lot of hiccups. Any chance your dad's around?" Owen opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsure what to say, but it didn't matter anyway. Sam barreled on without giving him a chance. "Because I gotta tell you, I've got a boatload of problems here. Too many for the doormen to be handling on their own." He reached out and put a beefy hand on Owen's thin shoulder. "Listen, I know you guys are going through a rough time, but the whole reason to hire a building manager is so there's someone to manage the building, you know? And on a day like this, it doesn't look too good when he's nowhere to be found. I think maybe he called in sick," Sam raised with eyebrows. "Sick?" Sam said with raised eyebrows. "No." Owen shook his head. "Then it was a vacation day." "After only a couple weeks?" Sam asked, then flashed a smile that came off as more of a leer. "I don't think so. No way I'd have cleared that even if he had bothered asking, which he didn't." "I'm really sorry." Sam waved this away. "Is he back now, or is he still sipping Mai Tais on the beach?" Owen glanced over at George, who was now at the front desk, and who gave him a helpless shrug. "He's back," he said through gritted teeth, "but he's not feeling well." "Well, give him a message for me, will you?" Sam leaned in a little closer. "Tell him the water's back, but not the pressure. And since he's already on fairly thin ice," he said, demonstrating with his thumb and index finger, only the tiniest sliver of space between the two. He might want to see about fixing it tonight, okay? There was nothing to do but nod. Sam gave him a little pat on the shoulder before turning to walk back over to the desk, and as soon as he did, Owen hurried through the mailroom and down the stairs, biting back at his anger at Sam and his frustration at Dad. It was impossible to know what he'd been thinking, simply taking off for the day without asking after a few weeks on the job. It was stupid and completely short-sighted. But when he opened the door to the apartment, his eyes fell on the kitchen counter, where he'd seen the bouquet of flowers just a couple of nights before, and something about the memory made him feel like crying. He thought about what Sam had said. There was no way his father would have gotten the day off, even if he'd asked. But Owen understood why he had to go. He went out there for Mom, to stand in the place where they first met, the rough wood of the boardwalk beneath their feet and the salty smell of the ocean at their backs. He'd gone to relive that day, and he'd gone to say goodbye. He'd gone there for her, and then he'd walk all the way back for him. From down the hall, Owen heard Dad. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. From down the hall, Owen heard Dad call his name, his voice hoarse. In the bedroom, he was sitting up now, propped against a couple of pillows. When he saw Owen, he reached over and switched the bedside lamp with a grin. "Ta-da," he said, "electricity." For a moment, Owen thought of not telling him about Sam, of letting the night pass without fixing the water pumps. He knew what it would mean. They'd have to leave the building. They'd probably even leave New York. The two of them could drive out west, find some place better suited for them, a place with more sky and fewer people. Maybe they'd even retrace the route his parents had taken all those years ago. Maybe in that way, Owen would be able to say goodbye too. But standing there in the doorway, he knew he couldn't do it. He had to give this a chance, if only for his dad. It was what his mom would have wanted, and it was the right thing to do. Besides, after last night, Owen wasn't so sure he was ready to leave New York behind anyway, at least not yet. Instead, they would haul the heavy red toolbox into the utilities room, where Dad would sit on the cool concrete floor with a glass of water and show Owen what to do. Together, they would figure out a way to make it work. They would figure out a way to make this work. Owen crossed the threshold of the room, stepping into the pool of light from the lamp, and handed over one of the water bottles. "So," he said, his voice bright, "now that we've got electricity, think you're up to conjuring some water too?" That's the end of chapter 6. Thanks for watching.